I found the note on my kitchen counter at 7:23 a.m., right next to my half-empty coffee mug and the wedding vendor checklist I'd been working on the night before. The handwriting was my mother's, that precise teacher's cursive I'd grown up seeing on my report cards and birthday cards. But the words, they were colder than I'd ever seen from her. Wedding's off. Expect a call from my lawyer. Mom and Dad. No explanation. No. We need to talk. Just a clinical dismissal of 18 months of planning, $45,000 in promises, and what I thought was unconditional love. I stood there in my pajamas, staring at the piece of notebook paper that had just blown up my entire life, and all I could think was how perfectly the handwriting matched the passive-aggressive Christmas cards they'd been sending me since I moved out. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 32, work in marketing for a tech startup downtown, and up until this morning, I thought I was living the American dream. Nice apartment, stable relationship, parents who seemed proud of their successful daughter. I'd spent the last year and a half planning what was supposed to be the wedding of my dreams. 200 guests, a venue overlooking the lake, the whole fairy tale package that every little girl supposedly wants. My parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, had insisted on contributing. Dad's an accountant. Mom taught 5th grade for 30 years before retiring. They're comfortable, not wealthy, but they'd made a big show of wanting to give their only daughter the wedding she deserves. $45,000, they'd said. Their gift to me and David. We'd put down deposits, signed contracts, sent save the dates. Everything was locked in. Everything was perfect. Except it wasn't. Because what they didn't know, what I'd never bothered to mention because it seemed so inconsequential at the time, was that the money they'd contributed wasn't sitting in their personal account anymore. It was in our joint account, the one we'd opened when I was 18 for family financial planning. The account where I was listed as a co-owner. The account they'd insisted on keeping active for emergencies, even after I'd moved out and built my own financial life. I picked up my phone to call David, my fingers shaking as I scrolled through my contacts. But before I could hit his name, another realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. If they'd left this note, if they were serious about lawyers and canceling everything, they'd probably already started making calls. 18 months of deposits, vendor relationships, and carefully coordinated planning. All of it could be unraveling while I stood here in my kitchen in shock. The first call I made was to the venue. Mitchell Garrett wedding? Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. We got a call yesterday from your parents saying there was a family emergency and everything needed to be canceled. We've already processed the cancellation per their instructions as co-signers on the contract. Co-signers. Of course they were co-signers. They'd insisted on that when we were putting down deposits. Just to make everything official, they'd said. Since we're contributing so much, we want to make sure everything's handled properly. The florist said the same thing. So did the caterer, the DJ, the photographer. One by one, my perfect wedding was being systematically dismantled by the two people who were supposed to love me most in the world. Each vendor expressed their condolences for the family emergency and assured me they'd follow proper cancellation procedures. But here's the thing about the Mitchell family that looks so perfect from the outside. We've been playing this game for 32 years. The game where mom and dad present themselves as the loving, supportive parents who just want the best for their daughter, while slowly, methodically ensuring that the best only happens on their terms. It started small when I was growing up. The piano lessons they signed me up for, not because I wanted to play piano, but because cultured young ladies play piano. The college major I chose, business, not art, because you can't make a living being creative, Sarah. The apartment I rented after graduation, the one they helped me find, the one that happened to be 15 minutes from their house instead of closer to my job downtown. Every decision in my life had been subtly guided by their invisible hand. And I'd gone along with it because it was easier than fighting, and because I genuinely believed they wanted what was best for me, even when what was best never seemed to align with what made me happy. The wedding planning had been more of the same, just magnified. They'd loved the idea of a big, traditional ceremony. They'd been enthusiastic about contributing financially, until I started making choices that didn't match their vision. I wanted a smaller, more intimate affair. They pushed for the 200-guest extravaganza. I wanted simple flowers, They insisted on elaborate arrangements that properly represented our family. I wanted a fun, relaxed reception. They demanded a formal sit-down dinner with assigned seating that kept their social circle comfortable. Every conversation had been a delicate negotiation. Every decision had required their approval. And somehow, I'd convinced myself this was normal, that this was what families did when they were close. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago. David and I had decided we wanted to write our own vows, something personal and meaningful instead of the traditional religious ceremony Mom had been pushing for. When I mentioned it during our weekly wedding planning dinner, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. "After everything we're doing for you, this is how you show your gratitude?" Mom had said, her voice taking on that tight, controlled tone I remembered from childhood. "We're giving you $45,000, Sarah. The least you could do is show some respect for tradition and family values." "It's our wedding," I'd tried to explain. "We just want it to feel authentic to us." Authentic. Dad had practically spat the word. "You know what's authentic? Appreciating the sacrifice your parents are making for you instead of turning your wedding into some kind of self-indulgent performance art." The argument had escalated from there. They'd accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. I'd tried to explain that personal vows didn't mean I didn't appreciate their contribution. But it was like speaking different languages. To them, their financial contribution meant they got creative control. To me, it was supposed to be a gift from parents who loved me. That night, David had held me while I cried and questioned everything. "Maybe they're right," I'd said. "Maybe I am being selfish. Maybe I should just give them what they want." "Sarah," he'd said gently, "when did your parents' happiness become more important than yours, even at your own wedding?" It was a question I couldn't answer, because the truth was their happiness had always been more important than mine. That was just how our family worked. That was the price of their love. The next 2 weeks had been a careful dance of compromise and appeasement. I'd agreed to the traditional vows. They'd graciously accepted my apology for being difficult. The wedding planning had continued with its familiar pattern of their preferences disguised as suggestions, my compliance disguised as agreement. But something had shifted in me during those weeks. Maybe it was David's question echoing in my head. Maybe it was the realization that even at 32, I was still seeking approval from parents who would never be satisfied unless I completely erased myself. Or maybe it was just exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness that comes from living your entire life for other people's expectations. I'd started making small changes, nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just tiny assertions of independence that felt both terrifying and liberating. I'd chosen the wedding cake flavor without consulting them. I'd added 3 more friends to the guest list without asking permission. I'd scheduled the final dress fitting for a day when they weren't available to attend. Each small act of autonomy had been met with passive-aggressive pushback. "I hope you're sure about that cake flavor, honey. It's not very traditional. The guest list is getting quite long, isn't it? I hope you're not going overboard." "Oh, you're doing the final fitting alone? I thought mothers were supposed to be involved in these special moments." But I'd held firm. For the first time in my adult life, I'd maintained boundaries instead of immediately backing down and apologizing. It had felt like learning to walk all over again. Unsteady and uncertain, but undeniably progress. Apparently, that small taste of independence had been too much for them to handle. Now, standing in my kitchen with their lawyer thread in my hand, I could see the entire pattern laid out like a roadmap. This wasn't about the wedding. This had never been about the wedding. This was about control. This was about making sure I understood that their love came with conditions, and the price of stepping outside those conditions was the complete withdrawal of support. They'd probably expected me to come running back, apologizing and begging for forgiveness. They'd expected tears and pleading and a promise to be a good, obedient daughter again. They'd expected me to choose their conditional love over my own dignity. But as I stood there, reading their cold, clinical dismissal of everything I'd worked for and dreamed of, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing despair they'd probably anticipated, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my parents. I felt angry. Not the guilty, immediately apologetic anger I'd felt as a child when they'd disappointed me. Not the conflicted anger I'd felt as an adult when their support came with strings attached. This was clean, pure, righteous anger. The kind of anger that comes from finally seeing clearly after years of looking through someone else's distorted lens. They wanted to play hardball. They wanted lawyers and ultimatums and the complete nuclear destruction of their daughter's happiness because she dared to have preferences at her own wedding? Fine. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. In their rush to punish me for my disobedience, they'd forgotten one very important detail about that joint account where our wedding funds were sitting. They weren't the only ones with legal access to it. I opened my laptop and logged into our online banking. There it was, $47,832. The $45,000 they'd contributed, plus the interest it had earned sitting in the account for the past year, plus the extra couple thousand I'd added for incidentals. They'd moved fast to cancel the wedding vendors, but they hadn't moved fast enough to secure their money. I picked up my phone and composed a text message to both of them. My hands weren't shaking anymore. My voice, when I read it out loud to make sure it sounded right, was steady and calm. Understood, freeze the account, that money's disputed. Then I called the bank and initiated a formal dispute hold on the entire account balance. The phone started ringing within the hour. The first call came at 2:47 p.m., just 3 hours after I'd sent that text. I watched my mom's contact photo light up my screen. The smiling family photo from last Christmas where we all looked so happy and normal, and I let it go to voicemail. Then Dad called, then Mom again, then both of them from the house phone, that old landline number I'd memorized in elementary school. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, researching everything I could find about joint bank accounts, disputed funds, and parental financial manipulation. What I discovered in those first few hours of digging made my blood run cold, and then burn with a fury I didn't know I was capable of. This wasn't their first rodeo. The patterns were all there, documented in family finance blogs and legal advice forums. Parents who used financial gifts as control mechanisms. Adult children who found themselves trapped in webs of economic dependency disguised as generosity. The cycle was so common, it had a name. Financial abuse. And the joint account strategy? Textbook manipulation, designed to create the illusion of shared decision-making while maintaining ultimate parental control. But here's what they hadn't counted on. I'd spent 8 years working in marketing, which meant I understood contracts, legal language, and documentation better than they'd given me credit for. And more importantly, I'd inherited Dad's methodical, detail-oriented approach to record-keeping. Every conversation about the wedding funds, every promise they'd made, every condition they'd attached, I had it all documented in emails, text messages, and my obsessively detailed wedding planning spreadsheets. David came over around 6 p.m. carrying takeout Chinese food and wearing the careful expression of someone who wasn't sure what kind of emotional state he'd find me in. I'd texted him the basics earlier, the note, the canceled vendors, my countermove, but I could tell he was bracing for breakdown mode. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, setting the food down and reaching for me. "I'm good," I said, and I meant it. "Actually, I'm better than good. I'm awake." He studied my face carefully. Awake? Awake to what they've been doing. Awake to what I've been letting them do. I pulled up the research I'd been compiling. "David, look at this. Everything they've done. The joint account, the co-signing on vendor contracts, the emotional manipulation when I tried to assert any independence. It's all classic financial abuse tactics." I walked him through what I'd learned. How abusive parents often used financial contributions to maintain control over adult children's major life decisions. How they'd create situations where saying no to their demands meant losing everything they'd invested in their child's life. How they'd position themselves as generous benefactors while systematically undermining their child's autonomy. "The wedding money was never a gift," I said, the clarity of it still shocking me. "It was a leash, and the moment I tried to slip that leash, even a little bit, they decided to hang me with it." David was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd shown him. "So what happens now?" Now we find out if they're actually willing to destroy their relationship with their only daughter over their need to control my wedding, because that account they want me to unfreeze, it's going to stay frozen until they acknowledge that their money was a gift, not a loan with undefined terms that change whenever I don't behave exactly how they want. The phone rang again, Mom's contact photo lighting up the screen for probably the 15th time that day. This time I answered. "Sarah, honey, what is this nonsense about freezing accounts?" Her voice had that strained sweetness that meant she was furious but trying to maintain her image as the reasonable parent. "We need to talk about this like adults." "The account will remain frozen until your lawyer contacts my lawyer," I said calmly. "Since you wanted to make this a legal matter, let's handle it legally." "Your lawyer?" She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Honey, you don't have a lawyer, and you can't afford one. We both know your salary barely covers your rent and that expensive car you insisted on buying." There it was, the casual financial surveillance, the detailed knowledge of my budget, the subtle reminder that they'd been monitoring and judging my financial decisions all along. Even now, even in the middle of threatening me with legal action, they couldn't resist letting me know they'd been keeping tabs. "Actually, Mom, I've already retained counsel. David's brother specializes in family financial disputes. He's very interested in our case, especially the part about gift money being retroactively reclassified as conditional loans." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete I thought she'd hung up. Finally, "You're being dramatic, Sarah. This isn't what we wanted. We just wanted you to understand that actions have consequences." "You're absolutely right," I said. "Actions do have consequences. Your actions of trying to financially manipulate your adult daughter have the consequence of losing access to money you freely gave her. My actions of setting boundaries have the consequence of protecting myself from future manipulation. We're both learning about consequences today." Sarah Michelle Mitchell. Her voice had dropped into that low, dangerous tone that used to terrify me as a child. "You unfreeze that account right now, or I swear to God you'll regret this for the rest of your life." And there it was. The mask finally slipping completely off. No more pretense about loving support or family unity. Just raw threat and intimidation, the tools they'd always used when their subtler manipulations failed. "Goodbye, Mom," I said and hung up. David was staring at me with something that looked like amazement. "Who are you and what did you do with my conflict-avoidant fiancé?" "She grew a spine," I said. "Turns out it was there all along. It just took 32 years and a really, really good reason to use it." The calls continued throughout the evening. By 9 p.m., I had 14 missed calls and 7 voicemails. I listened to the voicemails once, just to document their escalating desperation and anger, then saved them to a special folder I'd created labeled Evidence. The voicemails followed a predictable pattern. First came the reasoned appeals to family loyalty. Then the guilt trips about everything they'd sacrificed for me over the years. Then the threats about what they'd do if I didn't comply immediately. And finally, the attempts to negotiate. Maybe we could work something out. Maybe we could find a compromise. But there was no compromise anymore. I'd spent my entire adult life compromising pieces of myself away, one small concession at a time, until I'd almost forgotten what I actually wanted versus what they'd trained me to want. The wedding had just been the final straw, the moment when their need for control had collided so directly with my need for autonomy that someone had to break. I was done being the one who broke. The next morning brought a new development. Dad showed up at my apartment building at 7 a.m., buzzing my intercom with the persistence of someone who'd clearly been awake all night planning this ambush. "Sarah, we need to talk face to face," his voice crackled through the speaker. "This has gone far enough." I looked at David, who'd stayed over and was standing in my kitchen making coffee with the calm efficiency of someone who'd decided to be my backup for whatever came next. "Want me to go down with you?" he offered. "No," I said. "This is something I need to do alone." I met Dad in the lobby of my building, a neutral space where he couldn't corner me or make a scene without witnesses. He looked terrible, unshaven, wearing yesterday's clothes, his usually perfect accountant appearance completely disheveled. For a moment, I felt a stab of the old guilt, the automatic response to fix whatever was making him upset. Then I remembered the note, the calculated cruelty of canceling everything without discussion, the 18 months of manipulation disguised as generosity. The guilt evaporated. "Dad," I said simply. "Sarah, honey, your mother is beside herself. She didn't sleep at all last night. This account business, it's not necessary. We can work this out as a family." "We stopped being a family the moment you decided to try to control my wedding with threats and ultimatums," I said. "We can be a family again when you're ready to treat me like an adult instead of a financial dependent." His face flushed red. "You ungrateful." He stopped himself, took a deep breath, tried again. "We have given you everything. Everything. Private school, college tuition, help with your car payments when you were starting out, that security deposit for this apartment, and this is how you repay us?" "By wanting to write my own wedding vows?" I asked. "By inviting 3 extra friends? By choosing a cake flavor without permission? Which of those terrible crimes justified canceling my entire wedding?" "It wasn't about the vows," he said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "It was about respect, about gratitude, about remembering who raised you and what we taught you about family loyalty." "You taught me that love comes with conditions," I said quietly. "You taught me that support can be withdrawn at any moment if I don't perform happiness and gratitude in exactly the way you expect. You taught me that my own desires matter less than your comfort and control." He stared at me like I'd slapped him. "That's not... we never meant." "But that's what you did," I said. "And yesterday, when I finally stood up for myself just a little bit, you decided to destroy something I'd been working on for 18 months. You didn't try to talk to me. You didn't ask for a family meeting. You didn't suggest counseling or mediation. You went straight to nuclear option, lawyer threats and public humiliation and financial punishment." I could see him trying to find an argument, a justification, some way to make this my fault instead of acknowledging what they'd actually done. But the facts were too clear, too documented, too impossible to deny. "The money," he started, "is legally mine now," I interrupted. "You gave it freely. You put it in an account where I have equal access, and you made no legal agreements about conditions for its use. Your lawyer is going to explain that to you very clearly." The defeat in his face was almost pitiful. Almost. "What do you want, Sarah? What will it take to fix this?" "An apology," I said immediately. "A real one. Not, 'I'm sorry you feel that way,' or 'I'm sorry this got out of hand.' I want you to acknowledge that you used financial manipulation to try to control my wedding. And that was wrong. I want you to acknowledge that threatening me with lawyers instead of talking to me was wrong. And I want you to understand that if we're going to have a relationship going forward, it's going to be between equals, not between parents and a child you can punish into compliance." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I could see him wrestling with concepts that were fundamentally foreign to how he understood family relationships. In his world, parents had authority and children had obligations, and that hierarchy never shifted no matter how old the children got. I'll talk to your mother," he said finally. "You do that," I said. "And Dad? The account stays frozen until I get that apology. Not just from you, from both of you. And it needs to be real." I turned to go back upstairs, then paused. "Oh, and the wedding is back on. David and I are going to pay for it ourselves. We're cutting the guest list, finding a smaller venue, doing everything exactly the way we want to do it. You and Mom are welcome to attend as guests if you can accept that it's our day, not yours. But your financial contribution is no longer welcome. I'd rather have ramen and plastic flowers than accept another dollar that comes with strings attached." The rest of that day was blissfully quiet. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. David and I spent the afternoon researching smaller venues and recalculating our budget for a wedding we could afford on our own. It would be different from what we'd originally planned, smaller, simpler, more intimate. But as we worked through the details, I realized it would also be more us. The evening brought a text from my Aunt Karen, Mom's sister, who lived 3 states away but had apparently gotten a very interesting phone call. "Is it true you froze their bank account?" Your mother called me crying about lawyers and ungrateful children. She wants me to talk sense into you. I told her maybe someone should have talked sense into her before she tried to cancel her daughter's wedding over cake flavors. Call me if you need backup. Love you." I laughed out loud reading it. Aunt Karen had always been the family truth teller, the one who called out Mom's dramatics and Dad's controlling tendencies. If they were calling her for support and getting pushback instead, it meant their usual network of enablers was starting to crack. By midnight, I had 67 missed calls from various combinations of my parents' phone numbers. David and I had turned it into a drinking game. Every time they called, we toasted to my newfound spine. We were both slightly drunk and completely giddy with the intoxicating freedom of watching toxic people spiral, while refusing to be pulled into their chaos. "Question," David said, refilling our wine glasses. "Are you going to feel guilty about this tomorrow? Because I need to know how much emotional preparation to do." I considered it seriously. 3 days ago, the question would have been ridiculous. Of course I'd feel guilty. I'd have been calling them back within hours, apologizing and begging for forgiveness and promising to be a better daughter. Guilt had been my default setting for 32 years. But sitting there in my apartment, looking at the wedding planning binder we'd been revising with venues we actually loved and guest lists that included only people who supported our happiness, I couldn't find any guilt anywhere in my emotional landscape. "No," I said, surprised by how certain I sounded. "I don't think I am. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm acting from a place of self-respect instead of self-destruction. Even if this all goes wrong, even if they never speak to me again, I'm not going to regret standing up for myself." David raised his glass. "To Sarah Mitchell, who finally figured out that her parents' love shouldn't cost her her soul." "To Sarah Mitchell," I agreed, "who's about to have the wedding she actually wants." As if on cue, my phone buzzed with another call from Mom. Call number 68. I looked at the screen, looked at David, and started laughing. "Let them call," I said, silencing the phone completely. "See ya, they can call 1,000 times. I'm done dancing to their music." The real victory wasn't that I'd frozen their account or disrupted their control. The real victory was that I'd finally learned the difference between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and family dysfunction. They'd spent 32 years training me to prioritize their emotional comfort over my own well-being, but that training had just officially expired.